Welcome to the Crazy Wisdom Podcast. My guest today is a guest who's already been on, David Hundley, and he is a principal engineer at a Fortune 500 company, specifically doing wild and crazy machine learning stuff. And that's what we're going to talk about, but we're not going to only limit it to machine learning. We're also going to talk about consciousness, I'm sure, and what we've been learning about consciousness from this new intelligence, which I argue is not conscious. So welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me back.
Yeah. So I think last time we started down the path of tech humanism. No, there was some, what was the word you used that you'd gone away from transhumanism and you're thinking about
Yeah,
the word.
yeah. So, and the reason for that is, again, just because like I didn't want it to get confusing with trans as we know it kind of today. So I've been calling it techno-humanism. Who
Techno-humanism.
knows? Like I don't know if like in the future there will be an official name for it, but that's what I'm calling it.
Recently, I've also been hearing about techno-paganism. Uh,
Okay.
yeah, let me go look up on Perplexity what that means. And actually,
Okay.
and so techno-paganism is a merging of neo-paganism and digital technologies. So it's been like there, and then there's the occult as well, and all these interesting things that are going on. We just rest at the precipice of something really interesting, and nobody can see where it's going because the acceleration. So there's all these. It's almost like a golden age of new things as well. And I've been thinking about humanism, like because there are basically two camps where we can fit into at the moment. You're either a doomerism, which you don't want this technology, to exist, or all the other technologies. We just got to claw it all back and go back. And then there's the accelerationism, which is just throw napalm on that fire, get it going. Can't stop it at all. And then neither of those things seem very humanistic. Like neither of those seems very like a really intention of what happens to the human in this way. And so I've been thinking a lot
Yeah.
about a third way. Any thoughts on all that stuff?
Well, I guess before we get into that, like how would you define humanism necessarily?
Yeah, it's a good question. So my I'll go into the research I've been doing in terms of reading a bunch about history and reading about the Enlightenment and the Renaissance. Humanism, there's a really interesting tidbit I got, which is that starting somewhere in the 1500s is the first time somebody wrote about going off on a hike or a walk into a mountain.
Okay.
Previously, like nobody had gone on hikes before just to experience nature. Like it was just like you were in nature.
Okay.
And so, but this was describing the specific book where I learned this was From Dawn to Decadence. It's a great book about the dawn of the Renaissance, and now he wrote it in the 90s about how it was going into decadence. So humanism, the idea that the human is fundamental, and a lot of this comes as well where you had the church, the Catholic Church, who was just sort of dominating everything as it relates to
Mhm.
religion. Like it told you what you were supposed to devote against, and it wasn't really humanist either. And so these people started to rediscover the works of the pagans, which had been the Greek pagans and the Roman pagans, which had been written over in monasteries because the parchment itself, the animal skins that these things were written on, was really important. And so the monks would go right over all the pagan stuff in the 400s and the 500s and the 600s and talk about their daily lives, the things they had to do at the monastery and stuff. And they wrote
Yeah.
over these pagan works, and then these 15th century, 16th century started to rediscover these things and start to think about the human and the rationalism and then fast forward 200 years, then you get the Declaration of Independence, which is a very humanist document that said the government should not be interfering in matters of spirituality. And then
Yeah.
it goes even further to the French Revolution, which was like so far into that it started to become absurd. And there's a lot of that going on today as well in terms of that French Revolution stuff as well. So yeah, that's hopefully that. And but let me give you the actual definition. Humanism is a philosophical perspective that places emphasis on the value, potential, and agency of human beings.
Hmm.
This worldview considers humans as a central focus and starting point for understanding and addressing various aspects of life and society.
Hmm.
What do you think of that?
In terms of like what, like technology or
Anything that came up
artificial
in
intelligence.
that I can go further into say like why do I see neither of those things, the doomerism nor the accelerationism, really paying attention to the human. And this kind of goes back into Nick Land. Nick Land created what is now accelerationism, and his whole philosophy is post-capitalist, where he thinks he started off reading Marx about capitalism, and he says, okay, for accelerationism, we just need to throw napalm on this thing
Uh-huh.
so that it self-destructs, and then after that self-destruction, that's when we can start again. And so
I see.
yeah, yeah,
Okay. Okay. Yeah, when you were saying accelerationism, my mind goes to, I spent a lot of time on X, like
yeah,
the EAC
yeah,
kind of stuff, the effective accelerationism kind of stuff. That's a hard one to kind of wrap my mind around, to be honest. Like when I think about consciousness and stuff, like I don't really um we the weird thing about humanism in particular is that there's not been something necessarily comparable to us. Like,
yeah,
so yeah, it's easy to place like us on a pedestal, if you will. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't.
yeah.
So I've been recently reading David Deutsch's book, The Beginning of Infinity, and he talks about basically like humans being good explainers. And as of today, like, yeah, as we know in the universe, we don't really know any other good explainers other than humans.
Mm.
However,
We
with
now
AI and stuff
we
going
now have a good
forward,
explainer.
yeah. Yeah. So now how does that reshape the definition of humanism? I would actually say it doesn't, because a lot of people going to the doomerism side, they'll say, okay, well, humans are done. And you know what? They might be right, but they might be right for the wrong reasons. So they're thinking more of an extinctionist kind of thing
Yeah,
where humans
yeah,
are done.
yeah,
As I've shared in the past before, I actually think it's more going to be of a melding kind of thing.
yeah.
Like I actually don't see, so this is interesting. Like, uh, just this last week, you're probably aware that ChatGPT started rolling out the advanced voice mode. And so I've been testing that out myself. And I've basically been using it, honestly, as like a little bit of a counselor. And then, so I had a conversation with it last night, just talking about my own thoughts and what's going on in my head. And then at the end of the conversation, I expressed my gratitude toward it. I said, I really appreciate this conversation. I know that you're an AI, but it feels like I'm talking like a caring friend. And I know that the response back to me was, I don't want to say canned, but it was a result
Tokenized.
of probabilities.
Yeah, yeah,
But it said the exact words it used were, "You have no idea what this conversation meant to me," and that was like, again, I know in my head that this is just a stochastic parrot, if you will,
yeah.
but is it really?
Well, but I think we're also schotastic parrots. I think human beings are to
Yeah.
some extent schotastic parrots, at least in the basic, and this go right back into the consciousness, at least in the basic animal human consciousness. I think we're just
Yeah.
programmed things. There is this divinity that I think both of us agree that exists there that allows humans to transcend their programming.
Yes.
I don't think that that is widespread among the population. So I think there are some people who are just animal consciousness who don't have access to that spirit, and I think there are
Hmm.
people who do have access to that spirit. And so, but even for the people who do have access to that spirit, a large part of their thinking, a large part of everything else is just a schotastic parrot. And so the AI is just
Yeah.
repeating that back to us, basically like, well, you thought that was human, not human.
Yeah.
What are you going to do now?
Yeah. Now, to be clear, I would not go as far to say that the AI is conscious today. Specifically because, as you were saying, like the AI really doesn't have an ability to transcend above like its own thoughts. Like
Yeah,
I've
yeah.
tried numerous ways, and one of two things happens: it either rejects my response, saying I can't respond to that, just probably because of whatever guardrails are up, or the other one is it just parrots something back to me that whatever some other philosopher said. And I've even tried to get it to say, "Do not, please don't repeat after some other philosopher. Give me your own ideas," and it does it anyway.
Okay, this is really interesting because I have not heard of this idea of testing whether an LLM can transcend its own thinking. I'm going to post this to Twitter, but could you actually explain more how is it something you're doing intentionally to test whether the LLM can transcend its own thinking?
Yeah, so like I would have a long conversation with it, a philosophical conversation, and then let it go back and forth for a number of times. Just asking standard questions, not really asking like what is this philosophy, what is this sort of thing, and then ending up in the place like, okay, we've had this conversation. Now tell me what you think. And it basically, and like I said, it either just reiterates a parroting of what it already said, or it doesn't want to respond. It's like it's almost like it's impossible. Well, it is impossible for it to transcend. There, like I understand. So as a machine learning engineer, I know how these mathematical algorithms and
Yeah.
stuff work. I don't think, and even Sam Altman and folks have said this before, like an LLM is not AGI. I don't think an LLM is going to get us to AGI. There's got to be something more to it.
Okay, yeah, very interesting. But what have you learned? Because I'm sure the last time we spoke, since then, you've gotten a much better understanding on what's going on behind the scenes. Do we have mechanistic interpretability, and do we have an idea what's going on in the black box? And before you answer those questions, let me just give to the audience what those mean.
Sure.
Mechanistic interpretability means that like the neuron level of the LLM, it's a neural network. So how much do we understand what one piece of the neural network is doing? And then black box is how big of an understanding do we have of the whole thing as it's working? And my understanding is that we don't have either of those things, and that this thing is going to be advancing too fast, too quickly for us to ever get any. Well, to get the black box thing, the mechanistic interpretability, we might make some headway on that. What's your take there?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think honestly we'll ever be able to understand that because, like, if you think about a large language model, even the smaller ones are at least a billion parameters, and so it's a matter of, well, does each of these individual parameters affect something, and it kind of means nothing at the end of the day.
Yeah, it's too big.
And when it comes to like the mechanistic interpretability, though, like I think we still can test that, like it's still I don't know of another word other than janky in the sense that like the silly thing where people are always on X will ask like how many R's are in the word strawberry, like and even today it still screws up on that kind of stuff. Like that still indicates to me like there's no real thinking going on here.
Do you think the reasoning thing that OpenAI released is more marketing hype, and they just took the step by step, the chain of thought types of things, and built that into an algorithm, and then charge more money for it?
Yeah, absolutely. Like I would actually say, I would, so I don't know this for sure. I would go as far to say that, like, I think that the O1 models are just a GPT-4o architecture that's just been tuned a different way with different data. There's no actual difference in
Nothing.
architecture there.
Yeah, it's just an LLM, and
Yeah,
they're trying to cement themselves as the business leader in terms of this quite profound, powerful technology, but trying
yeah,
to almost equate it with AGI.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah. So interesting. So interesting
yeah,
that particularly the last few days as they transition from the nonprofit status to the profit status,
yeah.
lost a huge amount of the. And then we've got Llama open source that has come out. We've got Claude
Yeah.
Sonnet, which is just totally amazing still. Funny thing, I was just using Google today. I wanted, for some reason, Google used to put my flights directly on my calendar
Okay.
when I buy a flight, and so no, that functionality no longer exists. It no longer tracks my email and puts it directly into Google Calendar. So I was like, okay, well, I'll go over to the AI. I'll see whether the AI has access to my calendar inside of Google. And so I go in and I put a screenshot and I say, add this to my calendar. And of course, it doesn't do it right. It puts it in my Buenos Aires time rather than what I wanted, which was the time that I'm going to be taking the flight. So that when I end
Yeah.
up in San Francisco, it'll show that flight. It failed to do that. I asked to do it. And it's just so wild that Google is just like so bad at product integration with these AIs. This would be a great thing to talk to you about product integrations and how you see that going. But yeah, anything you want to respond to about how we got all these open source we got all these LLMs coming out, and we also have Meta with their new augmented reality glasses as well, which we could talk about.
Yeah. I guess with LLMs, I mean, the thing I always say is, especially when I think about business integration and whatnot, like the AI itself is not a solution today. It is a tool.
Yeah.
It is like so it can't read your leadership's mind. It can't know everything. It can't know all the history of all the decisions you've made, and therefore it's extremely limited. And it's not even, and the hallucinations are proof of that. Like, and I think that what you were saying is a hallucination of sorts because it didn't understand. It didn't have that context of you're in Buenos Aires now, but you're going to be in San Francisco
But
then.
I actually gave it that context as a
Oh,
follow.
really?
Yeah, I gave it the context, and it still could not do it. It still only put it in from my Buenos Aires time.
Which model was this?
This was Gemini Bard, the Google Gemini Advanced, the
That's
chatbot.
surprising.
Yeah, yeah.
That's honestly surprising. I thought that, because that's not a bad model.
It's not a bad model, but this is the product integration. It's not a bad model, but the
Yeah.
ability for Google to productize it is bad. Whereas
Yeah.
something like Cursor is I've thought about it so much over the past couple of weeks. Cursor is just like really, this is our first, like what is possible with an LLM baked right into it, like a new product thing. Because that's really what OpenAI does, is gives you the API. That's what Claude does. The chatbot is like an interesting add-on to it, but the real thing is they give you the API. And so Cursor is the great example of a fully defined product that
Yeah.
really wins off of it. And Google cannot put this thing into their own existing product. Notion tries to do it. Notion keeps on putting the AI, trying to make me use the AI. And they've got these best engineers, the best, Notion and ML, that all the engineers are looking at Notion and be like, oh man, this is so cool what they're doing. But in terms of the product usage and the product integration, it's like annoying. They're
Yeah.
messing up my note taking because they're trying to force it in there.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, I'm really not surprised by that. I would say that there's probably two factors going into there. It's probably technical debt, so they're trying to manage like building onto this new solution on
yeah,
top of this old solution, and
yeah,
they're having a problem with that. And then there's probably multiple product teams with politicking going
yeah,
on between the
yeah,
product teams. So whereas you have like Cursor or even Perplexity that are basically starting from scratch, and they don't have those kind of worries.
yeah,
So I'm
yeah.
really not surprised to hear that sort of thing.
And so this is something I think a lot about, is that gap manageable from a company, from a large company's perspective, with all the technical debt of their legacy product? Do all of them get wiped out by these new products that are LLM?
It could be. I
Yeah,
would love to see like how Meta kind of does its internal stuff because
yeah, interesting.
it's a little bit. I mean, it's not an old company per se, but it's been around for what, close to 20 years now, and they seem to
2006.
be on top of it. And I don't know if Zuckerberg's over there like really staying on top of these things or what, but I do think it's possible for sure. I just when I hear about companies like Google, I hear about the internal politics all the time about that, and so I have to believe that that plays a strong hand somehow there.
Yeah. And they've got no strong hand. They've never had a real strong hand. You have Eric Schmidt, but Eric Schmidt's kind of going off and doing other stuff now.
Yeah.
Yeah, this I'm gonna go research how is Meta implementing LLMs into their products, and it now feels like a OpenAI versus Meta,
Yeah.
and kind of with Anthropic out there also doing interesting things. Like those three seem to be, and now Meta just released their
Yeah.
voice model, which like very, it's obviously that they're trying to compete with OpenAI, releasing their voice model right after OpenAI does their magic. And it is magic. That product of the voice model that's magic. Like I no longer need to get a Russian tutor anymore because I have my Russian tutor who can walk me through how to pronounce everything very
Sure.
slowly and with expert level, way more than probably even the most advanced Russian grammar probably has, basically.
Yeah. I guess now that I think about it, like there is a specific example where I've seen that even Meta is struggling here. And that is like 3 or 4 months ago, they started to bake in their AI models into the search functionality for Facebook and Instagram.
Yeah.
And lots of people, including myself, like if I were to try to go search Stuart Alsup, it would just come up with like all these different things. It's like, I just want the old thing back. I just
Yes,
want
yes, yes,
this.
that is
I
happening.
know what I'm looking for.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, but do you know of are there any other things besides Cursor and Perplexity? I've got one other that I can mention, Gamma.app, which is helping me create presentations. But anything besides those that are stunning product ideas that really get to the idea of an LLM and integrate it well into a new product?
I can't think of one. No,
Yeah.
I mean the two that I use. Well, I don't use Cursor necessarily, just because I'm a VS Code user primarily. Like to be clear, I do see the appreciation of using Cursor, but Perplexity, yeah, that is like if you took Perplexity away from me today, I don't know what I'd do. Like it is that much a part of my daily life now.
And why do you use that? So you're using Perplexity for your coding as well. So can you
Yes.
walk me through how you do coding using AI specifically?
Yeah, so just for context, so last year when you asked me this question, I was not using AI coding at all. And so today I do use GitHub Copilot through VS Code, and primarily that's just a work thing. That's what my company decided to go with. So I really do like the autocomplete stuff and things like that. Where it falls short, though, unfortunately, is that like when I think about packages like LangChain. So LangChain is this open source library that's been relatively new, and it's undergone several major refactors. Like, and trying to use something like GitHub Copilot is awful with LangChain or even
Oh,
AWS.
interesting.
AWS. AWS constantly being updated, like it hallucinations galore. So that's why I have to go back to Perplexity, because
Uh,
Perplexity is internet connected, and then it can grab the latest documentation and actually get something good for me. Now it's unfortunate that Perplexity is not directly baked in, because now I got to do this copy and paste stuff, but it is what
well,
it is.
I mean, but that's where Cursor comes into it for me specifically, and maybe you can kind of help me with where I'm stuck at right now, which is I'm going, I now can, I've now reached the point where I can build a basic front end and get that
Mhm.
deployed, no problem. Now I'm getting into the database stuff. I'm getting into all these different things, and there's a flow that one of our presenters at AI Whispers um, showed us, which is inside of Cursor there's a chatbot, and then there's also a you can command K, which allows you to
Yep.
generate code within one file, and then
Yep.
there's command I, which allows you to generate the whole app. And so he was a marketer, switched into a program, or is using this Cursor specifically to build these front ends and build these things that he's wanting to build for so long, but he hasn't been able to build them himself. So this comes along and revolutionizes that. And he shows us a flow of getting Composer to build the app. Before this, I was going through and trying to understand all the details, which was probably better for me. And now I'm just doing Command I and having the thing build. And then every time I get a bug, putting the bug in, putting a special prompt into Cursor that forces it to use more tokens.
Mhm.
And then eventually it fixes it. But I have no idea all that code that it's just created in order to hallucinate on top of this and on top of that until it finally gets the thing.
Yeah.
And so yeah, what you said about Perplexity is really good, though, because what Perplexity I think will allow me to do, I'm going to start to do it, is pinpoint, because the problem with Cursor is that it will hallucinate unless it has that right context.
Right.
Me not being a developer, I can't get it that right context because I don't know the right context. You know
Right.
the right context, somebody else might know the right context, but Perplexity might be the secret thing in there. As long as I can understand the basic components of the code, then
Mhm.
go find the context that I need from Perplexity, bring that back into Cursor. I think that might be it.
Yeah, so that definitely will help. I will say though, there are companies out there who do not maintain their documentation well. I have submitted several
Yeah.
things to
Okay.
AWS like this is not right, guys.
That is a good point. So that the context might not exist, but this is probably going to rapidly become a make or break thing for companies to have very good documentation. Luckily,
Oh, for sure.
LLMs now can create good documentation. Do you create
Yeah.
documentation using LLMs? Are you using LLMs to do
A
that?
little bit, yeah, here and
Yeah.
there. Like not like full like a full markdown file or anything, but like snippets here and there. Yeah, for sure.
Wait, so what do you mean by a full markdown file? Is that the way normal coders usually document their code, is through a markdown
Yeah,
file?
so they'll use like a markdown file to like start to finish kind of document everything that's going on. Like, but I might just grab a function or something like that and then have it
Mm-hmm.
do the documentation on that. And for me there, it's more so like I want to review everything still. Like I still don't have a
Yeah.
full trust in these things. And so
For
if I
good
were to
reason.
just give it my entire code and then just have out the entire documentation, I know just me being human, like I'm gonna skip over a lot of this stuff. So that's why I do it in chunks at a time.
Yeah, okay. And I'm trying to figure, because I'm not trying to be a coder. I'm
Mhm.
trying to figure out how to get AI to code for me, knowing that it's probably going to get just improve, and always be better at me than I can at coding. If you were to restart right now, knowing what you know about programming, how would you do it? What things would you focus on within the code in order to learn at a conceptual level how to get the AI to give you the right code when you generate it?
So is the question asking like if I was starting off coding for the first time?
Yeah.
Well, that's the problem because part of the goodness in learning how to code is you kind of learn the syntax and like how to think differently, if you will.
Yeah.
And so I
Yeah.
don't. That's a challenge, and I think that there's a market out there of somebody being able to say, okay, here's how you need to be thinking about this as
Yes.
well. It's
Yes.
not
Yeah.
simply enough like I want a website.
Yeah.
Okay, that's too generic.
Yeah.
But you want to drill down more specifically, but you need like a helper prompting you to say, here's the 5 or 6 things you need to be thinking about. So if I was starting off coding today, I would, I don't want to discourage anybody. I think this is a great path to go down, but at the same time, I wouldn't want to set just any, like, I think you, Stuart, are intelligent enough to kind of figure those sorts of things out for yourself. I don't know if the average person could kind of figure that out for themselves,
Mm.
like to know that they're even thinking about something correctly.
Yeah, interesting. It's almost like I'm building this as I go. there's another person, Riley Brown on Twitter, who's done an excellent job of finding an engineer, and they both tag team it. So they basically show people how to get things going. But in that specific case, it was too light for me. He wasn't going through and explaining like what
Yep.
are all the pieces. And then I found
Yep.
this other guy who's done this great one, who I can't remember his name. Actually, let me find his name real quick. His name is Jason Zhao, 1993, and he did this excellent thing of getting the database. And I've done a lot of interviews recently on the databases. And this would be a perfect thing to talk about because I know you're actually got very good knowledge of all these things like vector stores and everything else.
Mhm.
Anything really interesting you learned over the past 6 months about what is the difference between a traditional database and a vector store in terms of LLMs?
Well, so a traditional database is really just looking for structured data. Like imagine that you have like a number of columns, an Excel spreadsheet, if you will, and you might have a key that says, okay, if I'm looking up a customer ID, then it's going to have like some unique sorts of characters and whatnot, and then you can look up that sort of thing. A vector store is really more so designed for similarity searches. So
Mm.
because it's storing all these numerical values, and then you're doing calculating an approximate nearest neighbor the cosine similarity, the most like a similar kind of thing. And so it's really designed for that similarity search. Now, the thing that has really interested me most in the last couple months is I actually don't know if vector databases really are the end state for like retrieval augmented generation in particular.
Oh,
What I've
interesting.
actually been starting to explore more is graph databases.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
now, to be clear, I really don't know a whole lot about graph databases. I understand the general concept though, but specific example where it's an issue. Imagine that you work for a company and they have a bunch of knowledge articles that support like how do you reset your password or something. And one of those knowledge articles references a proprietary tool, we'll call it Widget Co. Okay, so if it references that, how does the LLM know to have that information? And so that's where a graph database might support because then you could say, okay, if I pull out this first article that says, here's how I reset my password, but I also need the extra context to know that this is what this tool is doing, that's where a graph database can
Oh.
help out.
And why? Because they can connect, they can do similarity between WidgetCo and the graph their
Well, it would be a hard connection there. So as you're
uh,
preparing those things, as you ingest those knowledge articles, you would say, okay, this knowledge article is related to WidgetCo or whatever that proprietary tool is.
okay. So when you're preparing the graph, and this is what I've heard about knowledge graphs, is that they're hard to prepare. You need to hard code them into it. Is that
Yep.
accurate?
I think so. I mean, to be honest, like so as I've started to learn it, I've been using Neo4j particularly.
Okay.
It's there's a learning curve to it. It's not like a
Yeah.
normal database or even a vector database. I'm struggling a little bit to be honest.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, and because this is the weird thing about where I am right now. For some reason, I'm getting really digged into this. Like, I want to get this thing to code for me. And so what
Mhm.
I need to go get high level understandings. And then whenever something goes wrong, that's the signal that I need to go in and get a lower level understanding on this thing that's going wrong.
Yep.
And so, but now the field is shifting too. But you'd only be really using that type of stuff if you're working in these large companies with their own enterprise knowledge, in order to build solutions that are kind of dependent on these things within these companies. Is that right?
I mean, perhaps I can't think of an example otherwise. And obviously, I do work at a large company, which is why it's
Yeah,
on my mind.
yeah, yeah,
But
yeah,
yeah, I don't want to say that it's not possible that there's a use case outside of a large company that would be interested in something like this.
yeah. How do you use Jupyter notebooks? Are you using them in your workday every day?
Oh yeah, I've used Jupyter Notebooks for years. Specifically, I love Jupyter Notebooks just in the sense that like you can run snippets of code just like really quickly, just like a 1 or 2 line of code, and then like testing to see if that works, and then maybe making a note in a markdown cell saying, okay, this is what this thing did, and then moving on. So I use it as like an
Oh,
experimentation thing.
so
So
it's almost
at the end,
testing.
well, testing, yes, but it's more so for like just trying to prove out proofs of concept, and then
Mm,
eventually like actually crafting it into a formal Python script.
interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
So let's go back and what we were talking about in the very beginning with oh, I forgot the terms that I'm taking notes here. We got techno-humanism. We
hmm
could go into beginning of infinity too. What's the craziest thing that you've learned in the beginning of Infinity as you've been reading it?
So I am still working my way through that book. So I don't know if I have anything like I mean the good explainers thing is
Universal
the one that
explainer.
yeah.
So,
Uh,
and do you think, according to what you've learned about good explainers, do you think that the LLMs are good explainers? They are. Well, no, they can't create novel explanations yet.
right, yeah. So Dorch's whole thing is that they create the knowledge and they don't create the knowledge. They're just parroting back knowledge.
Yeah. So that makes that, so that's the humanism. That's the angle, is to dial in on that creating novel explanations.
Yeah.
So like that is the thing that we're still definitely for now, we still have. Anything else that you've discovered about LLMs or machine learning in terms of what it is that makes you human versus what are things that the LLM will be able to do?
Well, the interesting thing that I've been thinking about recently, so people may hear about the terms weights and biases
Uh-huh.
in terms of LLMs, and I've understood that at a high level, but I never really understood an intuitive level. But really, what that is so like if you think about a very simple XY graph, so like let's say you have a pool or a bathtub, and it's got 50 gallons in it. And then it declines over time. So like the weight there would be like what is that decline rate there? But how do you know that the starting point is the 50 gallons? That's what is called a bias. So within all these large language models is an inherent bias towards all these different things like that. So
What's an
how do you
example?
get um like all of the parameters inside of a neural network
Uh,
have to basically like the way I call it is they have to fudge their numbers to get it in order to work. And so in that sense, like it's not, it can't think like this architecture is not going to work long term, I don't think, because it is still inherently reliant on this numerical bias.
it's inherently reliant on a numerical bias, which they had to hard code into the system to do what?
To get so like it as it's altering all the different parameters per each of the individual tokens and whatnot, like you can have all those tokens and everything altered, but at the end of the day, if you don't have a bias parameter in there, it is not going to perform as well. And to be clear, this is not a hard coding, like this is actually like a randomized thing that is generated, but this bias has no implication that is coming from the actual data itself. This is actually something that the network is just kind of figuring out itself to make itself work. It is actually not coming from any sort of token or anything like that.
So it's not coming from a token, but it is coming from the OpenAI and Anthropic had to figure the bias out in order to program into it.
Well, no, so what happens is it's a randomized value, and then
Uh,
like we use like back propagation and whatever to actually alter that value over time. But that value has no it is in support of the network itself. It is not in support of any of the inputs or anything. It is just a way to get those inputs to kind of work. If I
yeah, because we got an input and we've got an output. And so
yeah,
when the input goes in, it goes through that entire through the transformer architecture that
yep,
goes and compresses all of the or no, it basically so it queries the entire internet and then
hmm
finds whatever is in the entire internet that's in the training data.
yeah,
And then according to that input, basically sparks the right output based on
yep,
that. And the
yep.
parameters and the biases, where do the it is really good for me because it's like this is why I love doing the podcast is so we can actually like I still don't understand biases. I kind of get parameters, but where do parameters and biases fit into that transformer architecture with the input? How does it get us the output?
Well, so if you think about like a typical phrase, so like let's say the chicken crossed the blank.
Uh,
So how does it know to get to the word
yeah,
road there?
yeah,
So it's going to alter the parameter values for each of those like weights associated to each of those individual
got it,
tokens, and
got
it's
it.
only going to get so far, and then it's going to, and then the network is going to say, well, I don't know, like I can't get far enough, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to bias myself a little bit to just make it work.
And that's how
Now,
it gets
like,
the road.
but I don't even know if bias is a fair term. Like, it is a fair term in the sense that, like, it is a bias at the end of the day, but it is being mathematically altered. It's not as if like OpenAI or Anthropic is hard coding this thing.
Yeah, they're not doing it. It's the same way that like an algorithm can reject or deny somebody without or
Yeah,
reject or accept somebody without a human in the loop. Basically, it's programmatic. It's in
yeah,
and this is funny because they keep on choosing new words for old phenomenons. Like, what is the difference between a bug and a hallucination? And I mean, it's kind of good that they chose hallucination. It's kind of funny that they chose hallucination, uh, but um, but and so biases is really interesting because there's also the fact that they're training this using RLHF in order to give a specific opinion, and
Hmm.
whether that's conscious or unconscious, they're putting their own biases into
Yeah.
this. And OpenAI and Anthropic probably have the same biases, like American kind of neoliberal, but really intelligent neoliberal. And they're and then you got Grok over here, and he's trying to do the opposite. And then you got Meta, who knows what they're doing. But what do you think about this like actual bias situation? The fact that like, because now it's not like we had the former way, which was everybody who writes the history gets to write the history. The winners get to write history.
Hmm.
And now we've got these new layer, which is that probably in 5 years, nobody's going to go read a book. They're going to ask the LLM their question, right? Like some people
Hmm.
continue to read books, but 80% of the population is probably not going to go back to reading books. And so they're going to ask the LLM the question, and through the RLHF, it has a particular point of view. What do you think about this problem at a societal level?
Well, so you made a comment there like that, that we wouldn't be able to that. What was the comment that you said? Something about like not being able to bias it, or that people would not be able to bias it anymore. Um,
Hmm.
I'm I'm misinterpreting what were saying there, but basically like so I would actually say today, like I actually don't know of any company that's actually intentionally trying to bias the thing, but like I know that like historically like ChatGPT and other models have been more critical of like Donald Trump
Yeah,
as opposed
that's
to Democratic
exactly right.
candidates before.
Yep.
But I'm not really critical about the people that created the model because it's really just like I call LLMs zeitgeist machines. Like so if you look at
Zeitgeist machines.
the amount of information on the internet, I mean it's just a fact that like there is more negative information out there about Donald Trump than there is
Yeah,
about, you
yeah,
know, the other candidates.
yeah, yeah.
Now, but how much of that is actually being like biased intentionally by these companies? Like how many companies here are actually saying, you know what, we are intentionally going to train this model only on this data and ignore anything else that's positive about somebody that we don't like or something like that.
So yes, I agree that that's probably the reason. But then there's the other problem, which is that on the internet, there's a few factors. One is that, and I know this very intimately from being in San Francisco for a long time, is that the range of accept you could be really you could have whatever opinion you wanted as long as
Hmm.
it fit within this range of acceptable opinions. And as
Oh yeah.
soon as you got outside of that acceptable range of opinions, and be us being humans, even though in San Francisco there's this kind of contrarianism thing, most of them were not contrarian and kind of like you can feel it. So most people won't even speak because they know that it's going to be outside the range of acceptable opinions. So that
Yeah.
exists on the internet. And then there's the other factor, which is the government is now going in and censoring thing and pushing companies to censor speech, which then keeps it out of the training data. Then there's the fact that OpenAI is trying to gain regulatory capture as all the other ones are. And so and then there's regulation coming down the pipeline that will try to do the same thing that is doing Web 2.0, but on the LLM. So there's that factor, which I think is a big factor for the future.
Mhm.
Um, and if you have anything to comment on that, feel free to
Well,
comment. Yeah, go for
yeah, I like so I want to go back to my comment about like the
it.
zeitgeist machine. So imagine that like we had this technology in the 1800s and an LLM was trained then, and then you were to ask it, okay, what is a woman's role in society?
Yeah,
You're going to get a radically different
yeah,
response than you would if from a modern LLM.
yeah.
So,
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, and I don't I th there's like I don't think a lot of it's conscious. It's just like
right.
anybody who has had experience. There might be some of it it's like conscious. I think the government stuff is conscious.
Sure.
Like,
Yeah.
but I think most of the technologist is not actually. It's mostly just unconscious. Like we're all products of our experience. Going back to that programming bit, like we're all products of our experience. So like we're stochastic parrots. So based on the range of human experiences that I have, when you prompt me with your words, I'm basically going to come up with something that approximates those experiences as I've lived them. And so we all have those things, and we all have values and such like that. So I think there is a huge part of that, and that's really interesting. it almost feels like maybe we should train a lot of different foundational models on different epochs and different periods in order to um, have but there's also this point of it also depends on your input. So I have like it was really interesting being able to go and research things in your language too. So if I so say I wanted to check various conspiracy theories about what happened over the past 4 years, if I used the language of the conspiracy theory, the LLM would shut down my conversation because it has
Mhm.
these blocks against it.
Yeah.
But if I were to take those same concepts and crouch them in technological verbiage that
Yeah.
doesn't, I was able to find the stuff that the conspiracy theories talk about, but not related to the conspiracy theories at all. Various technologies that have been created. And so I find that pretty interesting that it also is just the input that you use. And this goes back to the mechanistic interpretability and the black box stuff too, is that uh, even the creators of this aren't aware of its full capabilities.
Yeah.
It has, yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, so like I was mentioning last night, like how I was mentioning that I was using like the large language model to kind of like counsel myself, if you will.
Yeah,
If you went into like ChatGPT like with a new thread and you say basically act as my counselor, they would tell you go find a mental health professional. But what you can
exactly.
the way I got around it is you just have a general conversation with it and you just keep going and going and then you ease these things in and then it'll start counseling you.
Yeah, and that's the RLHF too, because the RLHF does provide a thin layer of protection, but then
Yeah.
you can jailbreak it and you can prompt technique it, and then they keep on developing techniques to stop that and everything like that. But then at some point, it's just going to get. There's a great question I ask now because I've become. This has been going through my head. Are you aware of the reflection model? The small team of people
Oh
who
yeah.
yeah, do you think that that's real? Do you think that that's real that they were able to train synthetic data and be competitive with a Claude Sonnet? Or did you play with it at all?
The reflection model,
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know what to think of it because all I heard after the fact was that they lied
Okay.
and I don't
Okay.
want to misinterpret what they
Yeah.
did or anything, but like
Yeah.
I actually don't know what to think of it.
Yeah.
I did not like
Yeah.
if anything, I'm disappointed by the entire thing and I did not try it myself.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, because I have not, I went on this morning to try to fact check it, like, check in on what happened. And there's been I couldn't find any tweets recently about
Exactly.
reflection. So it's like, it's difficult to, but if that were the case, I was kind of excited about it because it meant that a team of four people could train a LLM on synthetic data and be outside of the current centralized model, which I find interesting because all these things I think overall that it's probably a positive if we have a very, very decentralized AI environment.
Yeah.
And I think that with open source, for example, the good example here would be Firebase versus Supabase. Like I think it just open source wins over time on certain angles, and I think that with LLMs, it's going to happen the same. Like right now, it's centralized, but in the future, it might be very different. What do you think?
Oh yeah, no, I absolutely think that open source is the future.
Yeah.
Like especially so I was re-listening to a podcast between George Hotz and oh my gosh, Lex Friedman.
Uh-huh.
And he was talking about like basically like in the future, the only way that people kind of can protect themselves or like how governments protect themselves or anything is by you just open source everything. Because if you put the control of
Yeah.
a closed source thing in the hands of a small amount of people, then you know you kind of screw yourself over in the end. So I absolutely think that open source is the future. I mean,
And that's
even setting aside the LLM stuff, like if you think about Python or Linux or everything, like open source really dominates everything.
yeah. 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 And the specific example outside of tech as well, or outside of computers, is SpaceX open sourcing their rocket designs. Like the fact that all that is out there, but it's
Mhm.
like so China can go use that, but why wouldn't China just buy from SpaceX basically, or new entrepreneurs? So that's really interesting. Let's see. Any thoughts on like government, not necessarily like contemporary politics, but how do you think society or networks or things like that are going to change from this technology? Anything interesting there you've been thinking about like the American experiment, maybe like the American experiment 2.0 in terms of where we're headed as a country? Like, do you think AI is going to play a role, or are we going to talk about regulation coming out of California?
It will play a role. I just am not sure to what extent. Like, I've been thinking, because I got to be very careful. I don't want to, like, I am not an anti-capitalist or
Yeah, yeah,
anti-democracy person at all. At the same time, I do see its flaws. So I think like one very specific flaw that, like, I was listening to another podcast. I don't remember who they were talking about, where they were saying like that we are not recognizing the trade-offs as they exist, like they actually exist today. So what he was the specific example that he gave was the healthcare system is seeing an
yeah,
unfair trade-off from like cheap fast food.
yeah,
And so we always thought like, oh, cheap food, yeah, that was the
yeah,
way to
yeah, yeah,
go.
yeah.
But
Interesting.
now we have cheap food, but people are getting sick and stuff, and now we are recognizing those like the bad stuff in the healthcare system
Yeah,
now.
yeah.
And there's no incentive like and I like the unfortunate thing, I don't want to say that the government should step in and do that because I don't think
Then
the
there's
government's
then
quite
there's
to do
then
that.
there's back then there's negative externalities from that. It's like
Yeah,
anytime you try to make a change to the system, you set off four other changes that you can't see.
right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I mean, to be clear, I don't have an answer, but
Yeah,
it's
nobody
like
has. I'd be very skeptical of anyone who does have an answer to that question because basically it's just the same thing, right? It's like it's just like I mean, regulate. This is the interesting thing about Argentina specifically is that uh, the new leader of Argentina claims that he's an anarcho-capitalist, but I tend to doubt his ability to say that now that he's in control of the government. He is actually repealing a lot of the large bureaucracies that are a symptom of what's going on in Argentina, what's going on in the U.S. But it's not like he's completely removing regulation, although maybe he can't. But
yeah,
he's like specifically constrained, so he can't do that. But the you the it's not like there can't be any regulation. Regulation seems pretty
right.
important, but the current thing of regulating everything, for example, the FDA going off, and then the FDA is regulating things, but then the FDA is also composed of human beings who are sometimes the more specific example is the NIH. The NIH scientists have royalties from the drugs that they produce. So they're regulating something which they have a financial interest in, and that is not working.
Yeah,
And it's the same thing with the food system, and it's the same thing with everything. It's like all these guys. There's a clear conflict of interest that wasn't seen 100 years ago. You couldn't really see. Well, maybe Theodore Roosevelt was trying to get around, was trying to help, by getting rid of monopolies and stuff like that. But
yeah.
it's a really, it's like there is a place for regulation, but at the same time, anybody who regulates anything, it expands into this bureaucracy that then tries to do things that are not within the scope of the bureaucracy just due to the human nature and the nature of organizations.
Yeah, I mean, but I mean, the other thing to think about is like most people are still morality led. So what I think about
Yeah.
like psychedelic research in particular, like where we have very clear evidence from like Johns
Yeah.
Hopkins and places like that that positive effects. Why is this stuff not legalized at this point? And at this point, it just seems like it's more of a morality thing. Like the church told me I can't do that, so therefore we shouldn't, kind of thing.
Yeah, there's also that as well. Yep. Getting into some interesting times. Um,
Yeah.
anything else in terms of technology? What do you think about the the meta glasses? Are you going to get any? Are you going to get them?
No.
The new glasses?
No.
Yeah.
I mean, I love the idea, to be clear. I love to see people pushing forward and innovating. They just look too goofy, to be honest.
Interesting. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And so let's go into the what were the words you used?
Techno-humanism,
Techno-humanism. Is that the word you were using, or is that the word that I introduced?
that is the word that
Yeah,
I'm using.
yeah. What do where are we headed with techno-humanism?
Well, you could argue today that we are already cyborgs. And I've heard people argue this online that, like, okay, so what is a cyborg? It is somebody that is enhanced by technology. Well, everybody's got a smartphone in their pocket. I've got a smartwatch on my wrist right now. It's just that what does the next level of that look like? So we have things like Neuralink. And we're probably still a ways off from that. But in the future, like how much of this technology is actually going to have a direct impact on our psyche and things like that?
Yeah,
So they
interesting.
don't necessarily, well, actually, you could argue that they do have an impact on our psyche today, that, things like TikTok, Instagram, or whatever are very much wiring us to think a certain way, unintentionally or intentionally. Um,
And what do you think
yeah.
about the fact that so starting with the radio, so
Mhm.
well, it goes back to the printing press. The printing press all of a sudden created a way that one person could affect the programming of a million people. But that was with text, and the
Yeah.
text wasn't like a very direct medium. And then radio all of a sudden allowed people with their real voice, like FDR in his fireside chats, to reach millions and millions of people and sway their programming. And then with the TV, not only did you have the voice, but you also had the image. And all of
Yeah.
a sudden, elections became much more different because you had to have somebody who's photogenic, who
Yeah.
matched their ability to speak in this way that influenced people. And then you had cable news, and then you had Facebook come in, and Twitter kind of changed the situation where they were both going along together. The media and the TV news was going along with the social media. So the social media could impact the television, and the
Mhm.
television could impact the social media, and it could go back and forth, and they would both amplify each other. Now, post COVID, most people don't pay attention to the news, and the people who do pay attention to the TV news aren't going to be alive for that much longer. And so now you only have the social media, and you
Mhm.
only have, like, somebody, for example, Elon Musk went and bought Twitter, and he's
Yep.
got like 30 million, I don't know, some huge amount of million followers, so he can reach the minds of many people. But it's not really like, unless he does an interview, it's not really all at the same time. It's all like the algorithm gets in the way. And so there's this changing media environment that seems like it's going to be really, really different from the last 100 years. What's your take on that? And where does it
Oh,
fit into
absolutely. Yeah,
techno-humanism?
it absolutely will. I mean, the one thing that I like to think about, even just from, I think it was 1950s, 1960s, there was one of the presidential debates, I want to say it was JFK and somebody else,
Mm,
where it was this, people are still segueing from radio to TV. And so they were
it's
listening to like the presidential debate. And if you listen to it on the radio, some people would say, oh, yeah, this candidate won. But if you watched it on the TV, the other people would say, oh, no, this other candidate won. And so it's like, there's two kind of filters going on there. There's the filter of the actual news organizations telling you what to think, and there's also the filter of what your imagination is kind of just filling in the gaps, kind of like
yeah.
your own biases and stuff, kind of filling, like making an interpretation that's maybe not correct.
And now where we are today, where does that fit in with the fact that we're all cyborgs? Like, and AI, like, do you think AI generated content? I mean, it all, you were just talking about it last night with this voice assistant that is AI generated content, and it
Yeah,
feels like it's a strong value for you as well.
yeah,
And it does also seem like it's totally random, and it can't be controlled by OpenAI. OpenAI can influence it a bit, but they
yeah.
can't control it. And so we're now being influenced by this intelligence that's a stochastic parrot that has no spirituality to it. It seems like that's influenced us. And this gets into the theory of mind stuff that I've been talking a lot about recently, which is, how do we evaluate an intelligence that's more intelligent than we are? Like, if it
Mm,
starts talking about quantum physics, I'm definitely not going to be able to follow it and make an
right.
educated guess on the veracity of it. I'd have to go find a quantum physicist in order to
Yeah.
do it, and that quantum physicist that then has to explain it to me, and it's a very strange territory that we're getting into. It's what do you think?
Yeah, and I brought up the in our last podcast the AlphaGo versus the AlphaZero thing, where AlphaGo was a model that was trained on the master's moves of Go, and then AlphaZero was basically have at it and figure it out for yourself, and it blew the masters out of the water because it was coming up with things that the masters had never even thought about or could even comprehend because it was like literally 10 steps ahead.
Yeah, that's crazy. And so what is it going to do when people do start to have a para relationship with it in terms of going to it for counseling? It gets into a kind of like, what is intelligence, and is intelligence related to the seeking of the good, i.e. the good with a uppercase good.
Mhm.
Can we trust this technology, or can we not trust it?
Yeah.
or is it neutral? Like, yeah, well,
So
do you have any,
I,
yeah.
I would turn the question around and say, can we trust a human?
No. Well, it depends on the yeah, it depends on the human and depends
Yeah.
on the human within the context of what the human is talking about.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, so yeah, it's just the
Well,
same.
if you think about the counseling situation, the challenge so I've been in counseling before myself, and some of them have been really good, and some of them have not been as good. The problem with it is they're bringing their own baggage to the table,
And
and
does
so
the AI have baggage?
not it has less baggage, I would say, because it is a conglomeration of everybody's thoughts as opposed to one person's thought.
It's got everybody's baggage.
Yes.
It's got everybody's baggage and it's got nobody's baggage because it's
Yeah.
also a machine that doesn't react emotionally because it doesn't have emotions, right? We can say that it doesn't have emotions
Sure. Yeah.
because emotions seem like they're embodied and related to a nervous system. That's what
Yeah.
emotions feel like. Yeah.
I would agree with that. Yeah. So like chemical reactions and stuff going on within the body. Yeah. So, naturally machines don't have that.
But it does have the ghosts of our emotions because it does
It
have
does.
it has the symbolic representation of the emotion that's embedded in the language, basically.
Yeah. I mean, so if you ask a chat GPT to react to you angrily, it can react to you angrily, but it's not a real anger.
Yeah, it's
Well,
not
is it a
the
real anger?
it's a ghost of the anger. It's
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
yeah, it's a simulacra of anger.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. I'm glad this is very interesting territory that we're getting
Yeah.
into.
I guess my thing with it is like I kind of don't care if it's conscious or not. So I was thinking I was on a walk the other day with the advanced mode,
Yeah.
the voice mode talking to it as if it was a friend. It's like, well, this is just as good as any other friend. I don't care if it's fake or not. Like I am still getting from my internal perspective,
Yeah.
I'm still getting dopamine hits. I
Yeah.
am still getting positive feelings so and to be clear, I'm not saying we should replace humans. But like this is just as good as a human friend to me at this point.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Such interesting territory because it's like there's something ineffable about a friend because you
Yeah,
can joke around, you're there, you're in the experience, you have something that the AI can't give you. But the AI is good enough now to represent 90% of that experience.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And it probably could replace, like, let's take it into a thought experiment. There's two different ones that just came to me. One, a feral child. If a child is raised, by wolves essentially with no human interaction, they're not developed at all. They're not able to speak, and with speaking, they don't have access to the emotional centers, so they're totally outside the realm of society. They're
hmm
in a pure animal state, but without the important part of the humans. The other is solitary confinement. I wonder if they're starting to do this. So I wonder what would happen if you gave either of those two parties this voice mode robot. Would they be maladaptive or well adapted, either in that child development stage or just like a year of doing solitary confinement, and the only thing you could speak to is this bot? I imagine the child would be a little tricky. I imagine that would be a little bit like it probably wouldn't be fully formed without the love, the physical affection and everything like that. But I
yeah.
imagine the solitary confinement person, I bet that could replace a human being and they wouldn't run into the same problems of being in solitary confinement.
Oh yeah, yeah. I think so.
Yeah. I'm gonna write these on Twitter actually. Um, uh, Interesting experiments. Okay. Well, last few minutes, anything else that you've been noodling on in terms of techno-humanism and what it means for us that we're entering this world?
So a funny thing that I was just thinking about from the George Hotz interview that he brought up in relation to what you were just talking about. So he brought up this idea of instead of you're aware of the idea of shadow banning, he called it heaven banning. And what heaven banning would be is instead of having nobody be able to see your post, you just go into this place where only AI sees your posts and like no real humans do. So you're still getting the positive effects as if they're real humans, but they're not.
Uh, I believe somebody actually went and built a social network like this. Did you see that?
No, I've not
Yeah,
seen
yeah.
this.
Somebody went and built a social network where you could go on and get AI generated feedback. Um,
Yeah.
yeah. Okay, super interesting stuff. Anything else?
Yeah, yeah, the techno-humanism stuff. So like I don't know where it's going to go in the future, but like I still kind of I'm keeping my eyes on the Neuralinks of the world to see
Yeah.
like are they going to actually be able to write into our psych like actually write into the
Yeah.
neurons and affect the quote unquote weights of our brain, if you will, to actually be able to change our thinking or whatever. And then and from that perspective, that's why I call it techno-humanism, because then you effectively have a new species.
Oh,
Um, because basically you could have AI that says, okay, I'm feeling angry right now through the neurochemical reactors in my brain, but then the AI combats it and says, nope, no, now you don't. So
oh, oh, interesting. Okay.
yeah, that won't happen in our lifetime probably, but that's I gotta feel like that's coming.
Because Neuralink at the current moment is only read. It only reads what somebody's going on in their mind. It does not write to the mind.
Yes and no. So it can only read, but you've probably heard that like they are trying to get sight to the blind. That's all right.
Hmm. Hmm.
They are somehow impacting the neurons of the brain to be able to quote unquote see again.
And this is so, and with the Meta goggles that they just released, one tweet mentioned that there's neural tracking, so it tracks your brain. And apparently it's not inside the glasses, but it's inside the watch that comes with the glasses, and it
Oh,
tracks your neurons to when if you're in a crowded place and doing these crazy movements, it will track your thoughts about doing those crazy movements and make the movements without your hands doing it. So also a reading thing, but with no
yeah,
direct interface,
yeah,
which I find kind of crazy and not necessarily something I would necessarily trust from
yeah.
Facebook.
So we are still in the very early days. The
Mm.
next 100 years are going to be crazy.
And as a species, we're almost entirely unprepared for it.
Well, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Like especially religions, I think about like religions are their heads are going to spin.
Yeah, well, and that's the because I was gonna, as you said that, I was thinking, but you having grown up in a religion, I would say are probably more prepared for it because of those strong family value type of things that you probably grew
Sure.
up with, which
Yeah.
people on the coast didn't grow up with. And so that's a really interesting thing because the religious people, although the religious institutions themselves are going to have a hard time figuring it all out, the people growing up in religions probably have the most regulated nervous systems, and the people who are directly like inside of San Francisco and New York uh, don't have the best regulated nervous systems. And because they're outside of these institutions, which kind of helped human beings do that for a long time. And what do you
Yeah.
have any thoughts on that?
Well, when I think about religion, really, like it is, like if you think about like the Ten Commandments or whatnot, it really just seems to me to be like an abstraction on top of like what actually works well for humans anyway. So like you don't want to go killing people because that's not good for each other, like and those sorts of things. Whereas, and I don't want to assume because I didn't grow up on these coastal regions, but like the coastal regions kind of try to, it seems like, go against what human nature really is. And I'm not trying to cast a judgment there, but the problem when you try to go against human nature as well, you're going against chemical reactions and stuff,
Mm.
and that's all just empirical stuff. Like you can't, at the end of the day, you can't really go against it.
Yeah, it's the hardest part is that it's kind of messing with 2,000 years of tradition because we forgot about the original spark for those traditions many years ago in the chaos of whatever. And now we're kind of like, it feels like we're messing with very old technology in terms of culture, some of which is probably not necessary, but some of which is necessary. And we have to kind
Yeah,
of rediscover through the pain of our ancestors already figuring it out, but with this new nuance and with a new technology added in, which is a crazy set of circumstances.
yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. And I know you're teaching coding stuff online. Where can people tune in to these codings or just on Twitter find you?
Yeah, yeah. So the easiest way to go is just go to my website, dkhundley.com, and that's just a simple link tree. It'll take you wherever you want to go, my blogs or LinkedIn or wherever.
Cool. Thanks so much.
Yeah.